Además de ejercer desde el año pasado hasta el 2017 el cargo de presidente de la Mundial, el profesor Bugra, nacido en la India, reside hace 3 décadas en el Reino Unido de Gran Bretaña, en Londres, para ser precisos. Es profesor emérito de salud mental y diversidad cultural y profesor invitado de 4 importantes universidades. Ha publicado, por favor, si cierran la puerta, ampliamente sobre psiquiatría cultural y liderazgo, participando en 32 libros y más de 350 revisiones de publicaciones y en 150 capítulos y editoriales, etcétera, etcétera. Él edita personalmente el Journal Internacional de Psiquiatría Social, International Journal of Social Psychiatry, el International Review of Psychiatry, la Revisión Internacional de Psiquiatría, y el International Journal of Cultura y Salud Mental, Culture and Mental Health. That's one of the many things I can say from him. He is an excellent person, an invaluable friend, and really a good person. After
Thank you.
all his knowledge, I leave you with him.
Thank you.
Professor Bugra.
Thank you very much, Alfredo, for that very kind and generous introduction. What you may or may not know that today is a special birthday for a special person. It's Alfredo's birthday today, so may we congratulate him on his birthday.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The celebrations will continue later on. I'm really delighted to be here, and I do apologize for not speaking to you in Spanish. So I've done the next best thing, which is asked one of my colleagues from Paraguay to translate my slides into Spanish. So hopefully you will pick up certain things. One of the major challenges in psychiatry is how do we define mental health? We are very clear what mental illness is, but mental health is much more difficult to define. Sometimes we feel that it's the two ends of the same spectrum, that you have mental health on one side and mental illness on the other, and people fall somewhere in the middle. But I'm afraid the life is not like that, that sometimes you can be mentally unwell and healthy, because if you have bipolar disorder, so when you're high or you're low, there will be times when you would be mentally healthy. So part of the challenge for all of us is when we look at issues like human rights, it is absolutely critical that we should understand what we mean by mental health and mental illness. In the UK, in June 2013, 26 members of parliament stood up in the parliament and talked about their own mental illness. So they had illnesses varying from postnatal depression to depression, alcoholism, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, so a range of problems. What that meant was that for the first time ever, mental health became fairly high on the agenda. So every political party is talking about mental health. As you know, the elections are on the 7th of May, every major party now has a policy on mental health. But part of the challenge for all of us is, what do we mean by that? And equally importantly, there is this notion, the Royal College of Psychiatrists led on something called parity of esteem, which meant that mental health should have the same kind of parity in terms of funding, in terms of research, but it did not look at parity in terms of outcome. We know that patients with chronic severe mental illness are likely to die 15 to 20 years younger compared to those who don't have those disorders. So what I'm going to be arguing for with you this evening is parity of outcome and human rights-based parity in terms of funding, in terms of outcomes, and in terms of standard of living. We know that mental health is indispensable because it is important for our functioning. And one of the major challenges is that I want you to, when you go back to your clinical practice, ask the first 100 patients you see as to what they want from you. Number one on the patient's list would be to get better, to have a job, to have some money, to have housing, to have relationships, and medication would be number 5 or number 6 on their list of things. That's a major challenge for all of us, to try and make sure that patients get what they want, not what we think they need. And that's a major issue in terms of human rights as well as parity. We know that mental health is important in getting us to think and communicate, and also it's about self-esteem. When we look at the ingredients of mental health, there are issues about wellness. How do we define who is well? And that is dictated by the culture and the society. Because cultures determine what is deviant, and that deviant behavior then becomes directly or indirectly a psychiatric problem. But at the same time, I also want you to think about over-medicalization of normal human emotions. Let me give you an example. In India, among Hindus, when there is a death in the family, cremation has to take place within 24 hours. Then there is a ceremony on the 3rd day or the 4th day, and then the 7th day and the 13th day and the 15th day. And at the 11th month is when you're supposed to stop grieving. So if we use that cultural paradigm, according to DSM-5, billions of Hindus in India would be suffering from abnormal grief reaction. So we need to be very careful as to how we define and diagnose psychiatric disorders. As psychiatrists, as clinicians, we are much more comfortable in accepting the term mental illness. We know what mental illness is. Mental disorders are characterized by alterations of thinking, of mood, of behavior, or some combination thereof. But equally importantly, I would suggest to you that mental illness is a number of things. Again, the deviance and the behavior defined by the society. Tom Insel, the director of National Institute of Mental Health in Washington, made a statement when DSM-5 came out that unless we can demonstrate brain substrate or structural change, we should not diagnose psychiatric conditions. I think that's a very extreme position. There are lots of conditions where we do not have a brain structure change, and we don't understand it either. So we need to be very clear as to when we are looking at function versus thought versus mood. So where do conditions like Alzheimer's or ADHD fit in? Alzheimer is marked by alterations in thinking, more so alterations in terms of memory. And depression, on the other hand, is, you could argue that there are problems in thinking because your thinking is slowed and you can't think very clearly, and you may forget things. And how does that fit in? ADHD is about behavior, overactivity of behavior, and or thinking, as demonstrated by inability to concentrate. As clinicians, I also want us to bear in mind that psychiatric disorders have major social determinants. To my mind, all psychiatry is social for a number of reasons. And partly it is that there are social determinants. We know that if you're poor, if you live in overcrowded conditions, if you're unemployed, you're more likely to develop psychiatric disorders. For those of you who have seen the tube map of London, there is an underground line called Central Line, which is shown in red. If you look at the map, and if you go east from Liverpool Street station, for every tube station, your life longevity drops by at least 1 year. So 10 stations outside Liverpool, you're likely to live 10 years shorter life than if you're living in Liverpool Street. And we as clinicians never, ever think about those kind of social determinants as to what are the reasons. Why is it that patients who live in unemployed, overcrowded conditions more likely to develop psychiatric problems, more likely to develop physical problems and interface of physical and psychiatric disorders? One of the challenges for all of us, and I'll keep coming back to that, is that we need to be advocating for our patients with politicians, with policymakers, with research funders, and the reasons being, why should a patient who develops psychiatric disorder die younger? Why should they have higher burden of disease? Why should they have more problems? And we know you cannot look at health in isolation. You have to associate it with education, with justice, with a whole host of other ministries and other areas, employment, for example. And certainly, World Economic Forum has finally woken up that they established the first ever Global Agenda Council on Mental Health, which is going to be looking at mental health in workplace. And specifically, if you are working and you develop depression or anxiety, you may take time off. But on the other hand, when you're working, you're physically present, but you can't concentrate. So what does that mean in terms of the responsibility of the society? We know the social determinants, patients need access across health status is affected by health inequalities, and economic gains need to be distributed equally to make sure that our patients don't suffer. And for that, as I said, health advocacy is absolutely critical. But we know, and certainly it's true in the UK, that as soon as economic downturn started in 2008, people's mental state started to deteriorate, rates of suicide went up, but funding for mental health dropped down. And that is always the battle, that if there is competition between heart disease and cancer and children and mental health, who do you think is going to win? So part of the challenge for all of us in terms of rights of our patients, that we ought to be focusing very much on making those demands that our patients deserve better in terms of funding, and particularly in time of economic inequality and downturn. So the challenges to parity, I think parity of esteem is a very overused word. It can mean anything. Nobody would ever disagree with parity of esteem who would say that mental illness is not equal to physical illness. But when it comes to the crunch, and it comes to the funding, and it comes to research funding and resources, nobody wants to know. And part of it is stigma, both internalized and external. I also blame Descartes for creating the mind-body dualism, arguing that somehow mind was there, body is there, and they don't talk to each other. If you compare the Western or allopathic system with other systems, the Chinese, the Greek, or the Ayurvedic system, it's very clear that when a patient appears, they talk about a combination of reasons why they have become ill. And that combination is to do with diet, it's to do with weather, it's to do with environment, it's to do with not carrying out certain rituals, etc. And patients know that it is mind affects body affects mind. But somehow within psychiatry we have created this notion that patients who present with somatic complaints but have a psychological underpinning are inferior to those who appear with psychological symptoms. I think that's part of our own internal stigma that we need to be challenging, and be very interesting to have a conversation about that. As clinicians, we do not understand the causal pathway. We just assume that one thing leads to another. Whereas in psychiatry, it's much more that what has been described as web of causation. So it's like a spider's web. So there are lots of different things happening to the patient, some causing the mental illness, others being caused by the mental illness, and therefore there is a very strong interaction. And we know, and again it'll be very interesting to have a discussion afterwards about how much emphasis is being placed on public mental health in Argentina, and what does that mean. And to my mind, one of the critical things that psychiatry has not touched upon has been public mental health agenda. We know there is considerable epidemiological evidence which tells us that 3/4 of psychiatric disorders in adulthood will start below the age of 24. Half of them will start below the age of 15. So we need to get in and make sure that people are aware of parenting skills. They know the impact tobacco, alcohol, and drugs can have on pregnant women, on the families, creating domestic violence and creating child abuse and so on and so forth. So one of the major challenges for us that we need to be addressing fairly urgently is the public mental health agenda. What do we mean by social justice? And again, it is one of those terms that people think they know what it means, and quite often in capitalist societies, social justice is equated with economic justice. I think they're two very different things. It's a virtue which guides us in creating those organizations which are called institutions. Why did we invest in medical profession? Medical profession is an institution, and part of it is that people should have access to health care as and when they need it, as and when their needs change, the healthcare changes. And these institutions provide to the individuals what is good for the person, their families, and society as a whole. And social justice brings about on all of us a personal responsibility to work with others and design and improve institutions. And I think one of the major challenges for psychiatry and one of major strengths of psychiatry is that we work in teams. So it should be fairly easy for us to look at and develop concepts of social justice. There's no doubt that social justice accompanies economic justice, and I will come back to that, because when we talk about parity of outcome, it is about making sure that patients with mental illness have equal rights to jobs, they get paid the equal amount, and they have access to good quality housing, good social support, etc. We know psychiatry has a contract with society. And again, I don't know what it's like in Argentina, but in the UK, the main role for psychiatrists is risk assessment and risk management. As long as we do that, nobody cares about anything else. And I think that's a shame, because psychiatry is much more than risk assessment. And if we are doing only risk assessments, then we are becoming agents of the state, and we are being made to do things which any jailer can do. So where is our skill? So part of the challenge for that social contract with society is that we need to negotiate. What is it that society expects from us? And what do we expect from society in return? It's an implicit contract. It's not an explicit contract. And I very much hope that APSA could take the lead on trying to understand what is it that Argentinian population wants from psychiatry and psychiatrists, and where do we deliver those services, and what does that mean? There's a distributive justice, which is about profits and wages, and that's very capitalist way. But there's also participative justice, which is a very communist way, which is about input from labor and capital to try and work together. But social justice is also about feedback principle. So how do we link these three? And again, part of the challenge I've used the example from India because it's a major country, major economy, a culture in transition. More and more people are moving from rural areas to urban areas with overcrowding, lack of social support, uncertainty of jobs, and more pressure is being put on young people to succeed using Western models. And that raises some very critical ethical questions for the society, wherever it is. So, social justice is about society treating everyone equally well, whether they are deserving or not. And again, in the UK, particularly at this time of the elections, politicians are very fond of deserving poor and undeserving poor. An absolutely ridiculous suggestion. Just because you're poor, how can you justify it as deserving or undeserving? But it's also what we as citizens need to do to come together, to converge and create a sense of social justice. For mentally ill, it's about equality of opportunity in outcomes, social outcomes and recovery. But it's also about simple things like housing, employment, social functioning, and standards of living. We need to make a distinction between economic and social justice, although both may be embedded in each other. And what we need to do is work with organizations and inspire those who are weaker than us to come together. And I go back to the point that I made earlier. We as clinicians, as doctors, as psychiatrists, have a major role to advocate for our patients. If we advocate for our patients, they will advocate for us. Every time I have been to see politicians, if I have gone by myself, they all nod, smile, yeah, and then ignore anything I have to say. But if I go with a patient, they're really scared. They're absolutely scared to deal with patients. And 99 times out of 100, if I have gone with a patient, I've come out getting exactly what I wanted. So patients can advocate for us, and we need to advocate for patients, and that is part of the whole interaction about social justice. But another important factor for patients with mental illness is capability to be healthy. Every person in this room is capable to be healthy. But that does not mean that the onus or the emphasis is only on me to be healthy. It's on everybody else as well to make sure that enough information about drugs and alcohol and junk food and impact of sugar and so on and so forth is available easily, readily, in a way which is understandable. So it makes it everybody's responsibility as part of that institution to make sure that we are aware and we can take on the responsibilities to be healthy. So part of these capabilities are about when I was talking about deserving or undeserving poor, if you're poor and you can't afford to shop properly and you go and have junk food, surely it is important that both the providers and suppliers of that food make sure that people know what they're eating and what it means. Capability is also about understanding the causes and the constraints and the differential experiences people have in terms of understanding what is causing ill health. And that, if we link it with the public mental health agenda, we need to start training and teaching our children in schools as to what they ought to be eating, what they ought to be doing. And there have been some fascinating work done in different parts of the world, and I'll give you two examples. One is in Pakistan. A few years ago, WHO set up a program in villages where school children were taught to identify epilepsy and psychosis. So if they saw somebody in the village who was psychotic or who had epilepsy, they went and told the teacher, who did a structured screening, then referred them on to the community health worker or community midwife or whosoever, traditional midwife who'd been trained. They then referred, if need be, to a general practitioner and then on to the psychiatrist. So there are different ways of doing things. Now you could equally argue that it is unethical for school children to go around diagnosing people. But they're not making a diagnosis, they're just identifying people who may have problems. Equally importantly, I think it is that if children at that age become aware that there is something which is psychosis or epilepsy, they'll probably deal with it much better, and they will know the impact of stress, and they will know what to do, and it'll probably be less stigmatizing. So giving those kind of differential experiences and responsible remedies is incredibly important. So people's health or clinical outcomes and their capabilities are socially produced. They are identified by the society, they're nurtured, restored, neglected, or thwarted by a range of political institutions and processes, legal, cultural, as well as religious institutions, which function both globally and nationally. We know health and longevity are caused by the physical and social environments. I've gone through that, so I'm not going to go on more about that, but I want us to bear in mind that there are 4 key factors which determine, influence, and produce or cause a person's functioning and longevity. These are biology. Obviously, that if you have bad genes, yes, that would play a role. But it's also about behavior, drinking, drugs, obesity, diabetes, etc. External physical environment as well as social conditions impact upon this capability to be healthy. When we look at pathways, when people become ill, if you think of it as pathway to illness, there are a series of steps which influence their biological endowments and needs, their behaviors, their external physical and social environments, and their ability to access healthcare, whether they can afford it or not. Social conditions determine who's actually born and their genetic endowments. We know that. We also know that there are proximate individual levels such as behaviors and external exposure, and then distal factors in societies we live in and social conditions. And I like this quotation that humans are born into the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick. Passport of the former, i.e. kingdom of the well, and everyone will have to reveal themselves as citizens of the latter. So suggesting that it's very easy to move from being healthy to being ill. And if a person wants to be healthy, then the system within which we live has to allow us. And if we are constantly being bombarded by advertisements on smoking or alcohol or junk food, we all want to be a part of the in group. See, if you go to a restaurant, everybody is having meat and you want salad, you really need a lot of self-esteem to say, I'm going to have salad, I'm not going to have meat. So the peer pressure and the pressure coming from within the system is absolutely critical in understanding this capability to be healthy, which is about personal capability, it's about societal responsibility, and it's about cultural responsibility as well. One of the major challenges to medicine has been this distinction and a kind of biostatistical theory of health. Boots did a series of papers in the BMJ in the 70s which kind of took on this whole healthy versus unhealthy notions related to statistics, related to behaviors, and disease became a kind of very much a functional ability, so which is either affected directly or indirectly. And the definition is that health is the absence of disease. And about 2 weeks ago, there was an editorial in the BMJ again. They've suggested a newer definition of health, so which we need to be thinking about. Part of the challenge to Booth's arguments, I suggest, is that we have to look at social environment. We cannot ignore social environment. When we talk about health being ability to reach a certain level of goals or achieve vital goals, what do we mean by that? Does that make it too individualistic? And then we get into this kind of cultural notion of egocentric societies versus sociocentric societies, and the whole notion of confidentiality. If you develop a sexually transmitted disease, then you have to tell the clinic the names of all the people that you've had sex with, and then the letters go out to them, and they then get called and treated. We need to think about what that means in terms of the ethics of such an approach. Again, going back to India, when you are sitting in a clinic, patient comes in, he or she will be accompanied by at least 6 people. You know, neighbors' children, neighbors' children's in-laws, you name it. They're there. So the confidentiality under those circumstances means nothing. And neighbors will also pitch in and say, okay, I will take responsibility for giving the medication or making sure that he comes for his injection, etc. So again, within the context of health and confidentiality, we need to understand what we are talking about. And is it simply being unhealthy, or is it not being able to achieve the goal to be healthy, which is important? Being able to lead a normal length of lifespan in good health with bodily integrity, using senses and imagination are key aspects of our health and functioning, for which we do need social and political environment. I'm not going to go through problems of public mental health. I mean, there are problems because it's also about you making people do things that they may not want to. And there was a study a while ago where it was proposed that in a small village, somewhere in the world, I forget where, they wanted to add lithium to the water supply so that people's moods couldn't change. Now, I'm not sure that's a good thing. Or is it a good thing? I don't know. But that's, again, a dialogue that we need to have with the society to understand. any explanatory models for illness, and particularly in the psychiatric context, as I said, in spite of web of causation, explanatory models are not adequate enough to explain what's going on. In this web of causation, the web model benefits from identifying determinants which are amenable to disease as well as amenable to intervention. That's a very clever way of making sure that you're awake. Principles of health equity are about inequities. It's moral and ethical in contrast to inequalities. It's avoidable, unnecessary, and unfair. And society needs to, thank you, look at protection of human rights, promotion and protection and of human rights as well as health are basic fundamental human rights that we need to be working towards. Old epidemiology, which is sort of A causing B, links human rights with etiology, and I think we need to move further away. When we talk about health rights, right to health, capability to be healthy, human rights to be healthy, what do we mean? Which rights? Are we talking about rights-based parity? Is it parity of funding? Is it parity of outcome? Is it equity in terms of access to services as and when you want it? Is it gender-based parity? Is it age discrimination parity? Is it about civil rights? Is it about children's rights? How do we understand that? And we need to use a language in health rights that makes it clear that politicians can listen. And I see that you have an election coming. And this is your opportunity to ask the politicians as to what are they going to do about mental health of the population. It'd be very interesting to see what their responses would be. And I bet they would be pretty well similar to the UK politicians' responses. Yes, 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 good thing, but don't ask us to do anything. So it is, how do we make sure that these health rights are properly constructed and justified? How do we sell the idea to individuals, politicians, policymakers? And we need a very coherent, comprehensive understanding of health rights, looking at epidemiological, economic, social, and demographic factors to understand what's going on, leading to preventable morbidity and mortality. Health rights also have more profound potential to clarify, reaffirm, and redefine the fundamental purpose of the state. What is the government for? If a government cannot look after its most vulnerable population, it has no business being in power. That message needs to get through to politicians and policymakers and other stakeholders. Part of the tragedy is that the term has often been used as a very opportunistic term, but it does not grapple with the fundamental conceptual gaps within the ideas of rights, ideas of health, and social justice. Which is why, I think it's quite interesting, and again, it'll be very interesting to have a discussion about health economists' view of mental health services and the output and what that means Do we need to clarify and justify how such rights are needed? How do we do that? To my mind, human rights-based parity means that claims to disease-specific responses. Not that every patient of schizophrenia will be treated in exactly the same way, but a menu of treatments which can be given to a patient depending upon his or her needs, whatever their diagnosis is. We need to look at access to information, access to good nutrition, reducing social divisions, reducing poverty, reducing overcrowding, access to green spaces, access to public transport. And I think the arguments that we have to put forward in the context of rights is from theories of justice as well as moral reasoning. WHO created this thematic framework, and I don't have time to go through that, but just to highlight that it is the right to adequate standard of living and social protection, right to enjoyment of highest attainable standards of physical and mental health, right to exercise legal capacity and to liberty and security of the person, which raises some very interesting questions about risk assessment and risk management from our perspective. Freedom from torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, and from exploitation, violence, and abuses. And the right to live independently and be included in the community. And there are further details, and I'm not going to go through that, but it is that each country, each culture, each society needs to look at this framework to try and understand what we mean by adequate standards of living. What do we mean by highest attainable standards of physical and mental health? How do we make that accessible? What are the issues about legal capacity and to personal liberty? And again, some of these values will vary across cultures and across societies, and we need to think very, very carefully about that and what that means. Freedom from torture, again, that's a universal human right. Often gets ignored. Even in a culture in transition in India, patients are still abandoned in psychiatric hospitals, quite often chained, not given food, punished. We need to be very clear that that is completely, totally, utterly unacceptable. There was a tragedy in India a few years ago where there was a fire in this temple where a number of people with mental illness had been taken and were chained to their beds. And in the fire, something like 30 patients died. Surely that can't be acceptable under any reason whatsoever. Living independently in the community. So again, not many countries have taken the lead into developing community facilities and what that means. But also, I think part of the challenge in moving patients into the community is that the community needs to be prepared to have patients in the community. So that's part of the education, and it's part of training and destigmatizing of what's going on. It is important that when we look at services, and again, one of the major tragedies in the UK has been that we assume that institutions were bad, community mental health centers are good. We all need asylum from time to time in the true sense of the word. We need to go away where we can think things through and then come back and face whatever has been bothering us. We need to think very carefully what a range of options, crisis intervention, home treatments, etc., and what do we do with that? So I come back to this question, why should mentally ill die 15 to 20 years younger? Why should they not be full citizens? Why should social inequalities affect mentally ill patients disproportionately? Why should their outcomes be different? And we really need to grasp this interaction between physical and mental health. We know that if you are depressed and you have diabetes, your diabetes will not be controlled and your depression will not be controlled. If you have hypertension and you have depression, both conditions will not be amenable to treatment. So we need to think very carefully where we are going with it. Question is, would human rights-based parity have better success? Would it bring about better research funding? Would it bring about better care? And my suggestion to you is that it is needed urgently at local, national, and international levels. And unless we advocate for it, it's not going to happen, and that's our responsibility as a profession. And I'd quite like to end by thanking Professor Julio Torales for translating the slides into Spanish. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you.
Bueno, ante todo yo reitero el agradecimiento al equipo de jóvenes psiquiatras paraguayos encabezados por el doctor Julio Torales, que en pocas horas hicieron esta traducción de la cual yo no tenía noticia, y realmente para mí ver esto en español fue una sorpresa tanto como para ustedes. Obviamente que el lenguaje y los conceptos vertidos tan exquisitamente por el profesor Dinesh Bugra no son fáciles de traducir así nomás. Se hizo lo que se pudo, pero se comprende mucho más para los que no saben inglés. Por otra parte, agradezco profundamente a Dinesh esto que es una profunda invitación a reflexionar, que muchas veces no hacemos y que nos compenetra en todos esos aspectos sociales y de los derechos humanos de nuestros pacientes que no siempre tenemos presentes cuando estamos en la práctica cotidiana. Así que a partir de ahora creo que va a ser muy valioso en los minutos que nos quedan que ustedes puedan dialogar con Dinesh y tener esta excelente oportunidad que espero que se repita el año que viene, porque realmente su óptica es distinta, es profunda, llega a todos nosotros, interesa a toda Latinoamérica e interesa particularmente a la Argentina. Así que Dinesh, ¿quieren preguntar? ¿Alguna pregunta? ¿O algún comentario que quieran hacer sobre la conferencia del profesor Dinesh?
Sí, para el profesor.
Su nombre, por favor.
Escalier. Vladimir.
Okay.
Quería preguntar concretamente si el trabajo que usted ha presentado tan prolijamente tiene alguna base en la declaración de Almata. En esa declaración Salud para Todos en el año 2000. Si hay alguna base.
Yes, I think one of the major aspects has been the WHO quality toolkit. So I've used that. But my biggest challenge is that it is the politicians say the right thing, but they don't do anything. So my request to all of you as mental health professionals is to hold the politicians to account, to say, why are you not doing this? I'm not saying anything new. It's been said before and will carry on being said, but within the World Psychiatric Association, we're going to launch a campaign on social justice for the mentally ill later this year with a very clear message to policymakers and stakeholders that they need to focus on human rights-based parity and outcome-based parity. But WHO have done some work, as I didn't have time to go through some of the slides on figures on quality toolkit.
Sí, doctor Stein, Enrique Stein.
Sí. Bueno, primero, muchas gracias, profesor. Thank you very much. Me parece que lo importante es que, así como me parece lo destacable es el concepto de determinantes sociales, que se ha venido aplicando desde hace unos años de una comisión internacional que formó la OMS y que, bueno, algunos lo sabemos hace mucho tiempo, la desocupación aumenta los trastornos cardíacos, por ejemplo, y muchos impactos de la economía, y que sea abordado en un congreso de esta naturaleza, en donde la salud mental también pasa a ser incluida dentro de lo que tiene que ver con los determinantes sociales, me parece muy significativo, y que en esta conferencia se dé la posibilidad de pensar justamente la salud mental, como bien dijo el profesor, como parte de la salud pública. De modo que yo personalmente y nuestro grupo, digamos así, de nuestro capítulo, agradece profundamente al profesor esta presentación y nos hace pensar cuánto más hay que pensar en términos de las condiciones totales de las personas para saber que la salud mental, como todos lo sabemos, es un emergente de una situación más compleja que no se define solamente por la clínica individual. Muchas gracias, profesor.
¿Algún otro comentario o pregunta? Sí, doctora. Y acá, bueno, allá.
Hola, sí, primero agradecerle al doctor Budra la excelente conferencia. Mi nombre es Gloria Loresi Ima, yo trabajo en Psiquiatría Hospital de Día y Clínica de Internación Moravia, pero trabajo en un plan de reinserción social, en talleres. Y doctor, ha sido muy interesante todo lo que ha dicho y sobre todo trabajar este tópico de la justicia social, ¿no? Este tópico que me va a permitir, además de trabajar en el programa PAMI, nosotros tenemos pacientes con mucha vulnerabilidad social, económica, y realmente nos permite trabajar en el afuera. Quiero decir, en la calle, como mostrando el trabajo que hacemos para la comunidad, además de trabajar dentro de la institución, ¿no? Pero los pacientes hicieron una encuesta, los pacientes psiquiátricos de hospital de día, para la gente que pasaba por la calle, por la vereda, preguntando si conocían la problemática del padecimiento mental y también si conocían o tenían algún familiar o conocido. Esto los llevó a darse cuenta que había, de las encuestas que hicimos, sobre 100, el 44% sí tenía familiares o conocidos con padecimiento psiquiátrico, lo que los llevó a darse cuenta de que esto no es una estigmatización, sino que es algo que ocurre tanto como la hipertensión, la diabetes u otras enfermedades. Le agradezco su tema.
Muy bien. Doctor Lagos y doctora. No sé quién está primero.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la presentación tan interesante. Uno de los temas que yo veo, por ejemplo, trabajando con pacientes psicóticos y con esquizofrenia, es el tema del estigma y la discriminación y la importancia de lo que usted decía, profesor, de la inclusión social y cómo educando a los ciudadanos se puede hacer que la recuperación funcional después de un episodio o que vuelvan a trabajar o a tener sentido su vida sea más fácil. Un problema que veo, siendo que me crié en un pueblo y trabajo en Buenos Aires, es la diferencia en el anonimato de las grandes ciudades, que es mucho más difícil generar estos vínculos que contengan a nuestros pacientes y les den el tiempo para que ellos puedan volver a funcionar. Creo que este es un gran desafío para las grandes ciudades. En un pueblo sería más sencillo trabajar en esto. un comentario. Gracias.
Doctor Lagos.
Sí, para quienes desde hace muchos años trabajamos en el tema de los derechos humanos y al concepto de lo social lo consideramos como algo interno al sujeto, como que forma parte de su propia vida, escuchar estas palabras nos quita de haber estado trabajando en los márgenes de los congresos, y esta posición de hoy de Dinesh lo pone en el centro del tablero, lo cual nos abre perspectivas muy grandes de intercambio, no solamente entre los colegas de la Argentina, sino entre los colegas de Latinoamérica y el mundo. Muchas gracias, Dinesh, de todo corazón.
Bueno, lamentablemente el tiempo se acabó. Yo estoy como delegado de la región Cono Sur de la Asociación Mundial y estoy a vuestra disposición también para establecer cualquier contacto que quieran con la Asociación Mundial y con Dinesh Bogra. Así que con esto nos despedimos y le agradecemos profundamente esta nueva forma de ver un poco todo lo que está pasando en el ámbito de nuestra profesión y de los trabajadores de la salud mental. Muchas gracias.
I think before we go, can I take this opportunity of thanking the interpreter in that little cubby hole? Thank you for doing a fantastic job.
Okay, thank you. Y sí, por eso terminé a las 7:30, Riculita.
Déjame copiar el pen. Para que lo tengo muteado. No puedo estar en dos cosas en el mismo lugar. Sí, está muteado desde allá. ¿Para qué? Para. Ahora, verga. ¿Vos me podés abrir el coso? Doble clic y ya está. ¿Cómo? Cuando yo te diga